Have you ever wondered, if you could return to the past, not to change it but simply to remember, would the memory remain intact, or would the act of remembering itself cause time to shatter? Elias Vale is the last man who still remembers how it all began, and the first to live long enough to witness how it ends. This is not just a story about time travel, but a whisper from the very versions that were left behind in the past, a dialogue between memory, identity, and forgiveness. And it all begins in an attic, where time is no longer a straight line, but a loop, a calling, a warning. Be ready, because the question is not whether you would change the past, but whether you have the courage to look directly at it. Chapter 1, The Inheritance of Time. Elias Vale always suspected his family was hiding something, not in the way that breeds resentment or paranoia, but in the quiet sense that some things were simply left unspoken for so long they started to echo through the bones of a house, like the creak of old stairs that no one ever fixed because they reminded everyone that the house was still standing, still remembering. And on the morning of his 21st birthday, as sunlight filtered through the dust-heavy curtains of the old Varen estate, his father Oren poured 2 cups of black tea, motioned for him to sit, and told him the truth, not with ceremony or warning, but as if they were merely continuing a conversation Elias had begun long ago in his sleep. Oren said the men of their bloodline had a gift, a curse maybe, but definitely something that did not belong to the world outside their front gate. They could go back, not far, not centuries or wars or kingdoms, only within the bounds of their own memory, and only to places they had lived and breathed and ached in. It was not a power to be used lightly, and certainly not without consequences, but it was real, and it was now his to carry. Elias didn't speak at first, didn't flinch or laugh or scoff. He simply stared at the steam rising from his cup and thought of all the moments in his life he'd wished he could revisit, not to change, but just to understand. The time he let Sierra cry alone in the treehouse after their mother's funeral, the day he never confessed to Lyra Thorne how much her absence fractured him when she left for the archives, the instant he said nothing as his best friend Cal moved away and didn't look back. All these fractures in the timeline of his soul now lay like doors he could open. But Elias wasn't foolish. He understood stories, he had read the myths and the warnings, he knew that time was not a servant but a mirror, and every change left a fingerprint on something else. His father explained the rules in a voice that had clearly recited them many times before: no travel past one's own lifetime, no altering deaths or births, no revisiting a moment too many times lest the memory decay and blur into noise, and above all, never revisit a moment in which your child was born, because the thread of a life is spun so tightly around the chaos of time that even the smallest pull might unravel everything. Oren admitted he had broken that rule once, and while Elias never knew the sibling he almost had, he understood in that moment why his father sometimes stared too long at empty spaces in the photo albums. Oren Varen had always been a man of few words, the kind of father who taught through presence more than speech, through steady hands fixing a watch or silent companionship beneath a rainy window, a man who had chosen not to use his ability as a shortcut through grief, but as a way to remember gently, to witness instead of erase. Elias had grown up sensing something ancient in his father's eyes, not tiredness, but a depth like pages read too many times. Now it all made sense, and that day ended not with grand decisions or dramatic vows, but with Elias walking into the forest behind the house, the place where his mother used to bring him before the sickness took her, and standing there beneath a canopy of trembling leaves, he closed his eyes and thought of a moment, just one, nothing grand, just the afternoon he dropped a glass and Sierra had hugged him before anyone else noticed, and in the blink of a breath he was there again, the air warmer, the house still full of voices, and he watched himself as if through a veil, trembling, breathless, feeling not the thrill of power but the weight of memory pressing into his chest. He didn't change anything, didn't touch the glass or stop it from falling. He just stood in the doorway and wept, not because he was sad, but because he realized how easily we forget the small mercies of the past, how much love goes unnoticed until it's too late to say thank you. When he returned, the forest was quiet, the sun already lower, and his hands were shaking in a weighty. Chapter 2, First Jumps. Elias waited 3 days, not because he was afraid, but because he knew once he started, he might not stop. The weight of possibility had its own gravity, and he could already feel it pulling at the edges of his mind like tide on a crumbling shoreline. The attic creaked above him at night, not from wind or wood fatigue, but like it remembered something too, like it was holding its breath with him, waiting for the decision he hadn't spoken aloud. On the fourth night, when the sky outside was stained with that purplish-gray color only found between storms, he climbed the stairs alone, each step like a countdown. The air on the upper floor was dense, stale, the kind of stillness that carried the scent of time itself: dust, wood, forgotten boxes, old wires, and something sharper underneath, like static clinging to memory. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him with a soft click that echoed too loud in the silence, turned off the lights, stood there in total darkness with his pulse in his ears, and whispered a date, not as command, not as spell, but as confession. The first time he saw Lyra Thorne, the library, the silence, the feeling of time stopping inside his skin, the memory cracked open and the world shifted around him, not violently, not like a machine revving, but like a page turning in a forgotten book, slowly, irreversibly. The smell came first: lemon polish, paper, and the faint warmth of old sunlight streaming through high glass. The room formed next. The long wooden tables, the towering shelves, and the quality of light that always made it feel like afternoon even when it wasn't. And then she was there, Lyra, across the room, unaware of being watched by her own past, her head tilted, her pen held just above the paper, a line of concentration drawn across her brow. She looked exactly as he remembered, because memory, when strong enough, refuses to decay. Elias didn't move, didn't speak. He stood at the edge of the moment like a trespasser in a dream, as if memory could be sacred and stepping too close might defile it. And then he was back, ripped gently out of it like a diver breaking the surface, gasping, the attic around him again, the darkness colder, the dust heavier, his heart thudding in his throat like it hadn't caught up to his return. It had worked, not just mechanically but emotionally, viscerally, and that frightened him more than anything, because now it was real. And real things have consequences. He began testing the edges of the gift with cautious hunger, choosing memories that anchor deep events that left scars or songs. The day Sierra lied to protect him from punishment, her hand trembling in his, the day he failed to do the same, the night his mother looked at him from the hospital bed and asked who he was. Each jump felt different, some like slipping through silk, others like smashing through glass, and when he returned he always came back with a slight sway, a coldness in his fingertips, a kind of emotional static that took hours to burn off. He began documenting it all in a notebook that no one else would ever read, not just where he went, but what changed, what stayed, what refused to shift even when he begged it to. He learned that not all memories were safe, and not all of them wanted to be visited. And then he broke a rule, just one. In a moment he wasn't even thinking, a familiar laugh, a streetlight flickering, Cal beside him in the memory of a long-ago summer, and Elias reached out and touched his shoulder, not hard, not meaning to change anything, just a reflex of old friendship, a gesture so ordinary it barely existed. But when he returned, something was wrong. His screen blinked, a message unread for 2 years suddenly marked as new, from Cal. One sentence almost turned back that day. Thought I saw you. His stomach twisted as if the floor beneath him had shifted a few inches to the left. Time wasn't a straight path, it was a net, a field of interconnected threads where every movement trembled outward. Elias saw it clearly now. The gift wasn't about return, it was about ripple. Chapter 3, The Girl from Another Timeline. He didn't mean to find her again, not like this, not in a fragment he had already lived and filed away in the quiet archives of his mind, but memory has a way of circling back, pulling you toward the things that left the deepest cuts. And Lyra Thorne was one of those cuts, sharp, unfinished, still warm at the edges. It started with a flicker, not a date or a year, just a feeling, a scent maybe, the weight of air before a storm. He didn't choose the moment, it chose him. He closed his eyes one evening in the attic, without planning, without even wanting to go back, and the world bent again, soft this time, like fabric being pulled taut, and suddenly he was standing outside the archive building. Late autumn, the trees bare, the wind full of static and fallen leaves, and there she was, across the courtyard, laughing, someone else beside her, someone whose face he didn't remember, maybe never knew, but it didn't matter, because Lyra was there, alive in motion, scarf caught in the wind, boots crunching on gravel, and Elias felt it all at once, like a rush of color after months of grayscale. This wasn't just memory. It was longing shaped into reality. He knew better than to move, better than to speak, but he stayed too long, watched too closely, and something changed. Her laugh faltered. She turned, not toward him exactly, but toward the space where he stood, her gaze brushing the air like she'd heard a whisper without sound, and for a split second, Elias swore she looked straight through time and saw him. He pulled himself out hard, breath ragged, hands gripping the floorboards of the attic like he was afraid he might fall through them, his heart hammering not from exertion but from recognition, because that wasn't how it had gone, not in his version, in the original memory. She never looked back, she never paused. It was a clean cut, a wound he had learned to live with, but this felt wrong, like a line had been rewritten without permission. The next day he went back, to a different moment, the same place, and she wasn't alone. She was talking to someone else, and then she said his name, softly, curiously, as if it tasted strange in her mouth. "Elias," she said, "I dreamed about you last night, but we weren't here. We were somewhere colder, older, and you looked the same, only you didn't know me." Elias felt a chill that started in his teeth and moved down his spine. The timeline was changing, not violently, not obviously, but like ice melting beneath the surface, small cracks forming, shifting the foundation. He had always believed he was the only one moving through time, that the rest of the world remained locked in its singular forward motion. But what if that wasn't true? What if there were echoes, fragments, reverberations left behind in people he had touched emotionally, if not physically? He didn't answer her. He couldn't. He returned to the attic and sat in the dark for hours, trying to piece it together. Time wasn't a machine, it was a consciousness, or at least something like it, something aware of being touched, and maybe when you visited a moment too often, it became aware of you too. He started tracking his jumps more obsessively, not just where and when but how often, how long he stayed, what changed in the return, and the data didn't lie. Things were shifting, subtly, colors slightly off, conversations he remembered word for word now ending differently, Cal mentioning a detail he had never said before, Sierra humming a tune she shouldn't know, like reality was rewriting itself around him in micro-adjustments, and always, it circled back to Lyra. She was the constant, the anomaly, the point of divergence. He visited the first time they met, again, this time watching from a different angle, and there it was, a twitch in her expression, the moment her eyes swept the room and paused, not on him, but near him, as if a part of her remembered something she never lived, a déjà vu that didn't belong to her. And it was then that Elias realized he wasn't just jumping into memories, he was leaving something behind, a track. Chapter 4, The Echo Chamber. The attic had become more than a room, it was a threshold, a breach, a chamber where the laws of time bent like light through glass. Elias didn't remember when it stopped feeling like home and started feeling like a machine, a place you entered and never came out quite the same. The air in there was different now, still, but humming, as if something invisible moved through it with intention. He sat cross-legged in the dark more often than he slept, not because he needed to jump again, but because he needed to understand what he had already done. He replayed the moment on the rooftop over and over, the way Lyra had looked straight through him, not with surprise, but with recognition, and not just the recognition of a face, but of presence, like she had felt him in her bones before her eyes confirmed what she could not name. The timeline had cracked, not broken, but flexed, and in that flex 1,000 versions of her might now exist, each one touched by his longing, his intrusion. And Elias knew with a kind of cold clarity that his gift was no longer private. Whatever quiet echoes he left behind were not fading anymore, they were compounding, building pressure in the seams of reality, and he didn't know what would happen when those seams split, if they ever did, or if this was just how time unraveled slowly, politely, until it wasn't. He started noticing things, small at first, a book on the wrong shelf, a scratch on the stair rail that hadn't been there yesterday, the kind of details most people would never catch, but Elias saw them all, because once you've seen time bend, you can't stop noticing the tremors. He ran experiments, simple ones. He'd jump to a minor moment 5 minutes in the past, move a spoon, change a song on the radio, return, and watch. Sometimes nothing changed, sometimes everything did. Cira once walked into the kitchen humming a song she swore she'd never heard before. Cal mentioned a memory they never shared. Oren stayed up all night, fixing a clock that wasn't broken. The world was folding in on itself, and Elias had no one to tell because he had become the center of the disturbance, the eye of a storm made entirely of cause and effect colliding in ways the universe never intended. He called it the echo chamber, not out loud, not even in his notes, but in his head, because that's what it felt like now. Every jump was a shout and reality was the chamber that shouted back, but never in the same voice, sometimes softer, sometimes louder, always changed. He began recording his jumps in layers, not just time and place, but intensity, duration, residue. He created a crude system to measure the distortion, a sliding scale based on how much noise the memory made when he left it. High resonance moments seemed to carry weight, leave ripples. Low resonance ones faded cleanly, harmless. He thought maybe he could control it, maybe the echo could be contained, until he revisited the moment when his mother died. It was a cold room, full of metal and light, antiseptic, and time slowed to molasses. The machines had stopped beeping 5 seconds before he entered. The breath had already left her, but the memory still hurt like it had claws. He didn't touch anything, didn't breathe on anything, just stood in the corner. But when he returned, the house smelled different, like her perfume, like a presence that shouldn't be there anymore. And in the hallway outside the attic, her photo frame had tilted 30 degrees to the left. He corrected it, heart pounding, then came back the next morning and it was tilted again, exactly the same angle. Elias stopped sleeping, not just because of fear, but because of wonder. He began to suspect that time wasn't just reflecting him, it was listening, and not in the metaphorical sense, but literally, as if the fabric of causality had developed an ear for his thoughts, his emotions, and was shaping itself accordingly. He tested it, started to think things instead of doing them, and found subtle confirmation. A light flickered when he imagined fire. A song played on the radio the moment he. Chapter 5, The Divergence Signal. The signal came at 3:14 in the morning, not as sound or light or motion, but as absence, a sudden dead quiet that erased everything. The low hum of the attic's electric wiring, gone. The tick of the clocks, gone. Even the wind outside, silenced, like the world had paused to take a breath and forgotten how to exhale. Elias opened his eyes and immediately knew something had shifted, not in the way you know a door has moved, but in the way your skin knows when someone is staring at you from a place you can see. It wasn't fear, it was proximity, like something vast and mathematical had brushed against the edge of his awareness. He stood slowly, his hands numb, not from cold but from uncertainty, the kind of numbness that happens when the laws you trust start to crack. The attic was still there, but wrong. The shadows weren't where they belonged. The light from the street lamp outside bled through the slats in angles that didn't obey geometry, and the dust in the air moved as if stirred by breath that wasn't his. He spoke a name, Lyra, just to ground himself, to test if his voice still worked. It did, but the sound came back delayed, warped, like it had taken a detour through some foreign space before arriving back in his ears. He turned to the far wall where his notebook sat, where the string maps and diagrams were pinned. But they too had shifted, slightly, nothing major, just enough to tell him that the version of this room he stood in wasn't exactly the same one he fell asleep in, and that meant only one thing: he had crossed into a divergent branch, not by jumping but by drifting, or worse, being pulled. He checked the time. The clock was blinking, frozen at 3:14, a number he had seen before, scrawled in the margins of an early note he barely remembered writing, back when he first started logging jumps. Back when he still believed he was alone in this. The number had shown up several times since, in receipts, in timestamps, on the tag of a shirt he never bought, always the same, always unremarkable until now. He sat down, heartbeat slowing not because he was calm but because adrenaline had given up. He whispered the time again, 3:14, and with it came a memory, or something that looked like one, not his own, but implanted, a flash of a hallway he had never walked, of Lyra standing in a doorway she didn't recognize, of himself, older, thinner, eyes sunken like he hadn't slept in years, saying something he couldn't hear. The image snapped away, like a static signal cutting off, and when it did, the silence returned with weight, heavy, suffocating, and then the light came back, not gradually, but all at once, harsh and too white, too clean, like a reset had been triggered. Elias checked the room again, everything in its place now, notebooks untouched, clocks moving, air normal, but the feeling remained, the absolute certainty that the version of himself in this moment was not the same one who had existed an hour ago, and if he wasn't the same, then what had changed? He grabbed the notebook, flipped back to the earliest pages, and saw it the first time he had written down a theory he didn't understand, the possibility of side-branched resonance, a condition where memories bleed across not through willful jumps but through accumulated pressure, too many visits to the same node, too much emotional energy tied to a fixed point. The theory had no math behind it, just instinct, but now it felt real, now it felt like warning. Because if he was experiencing a divergence bleed, then so were others, possibly including Lyra, or worse, other versions of himself. He scoured the rest of the attic, looking for more signs, but what he found instead was something he had never seen before, a message, carved faintly into the wooden beam above the window. The words were crooked, rushed, burned into the wood as if made with a hot wire, and they read, "Stop looping." It was his handwriting, or close enough to feel like a threat. A version of himself had been here, or would be, or was, he didn't know the right tense anymore, only that the message wasn't. Chapter 6, The Fragmented Self. He woke up on the floor with blood in his mouth and no memory of how he got there. The attic was cold, darker than usual, the light bulb overhead dead, the air thick with something metallic. It took him a full minute to stand, to orient, to remember who he was supposed to be, not because he had forgotten, but because too many versions of that answer were now vying for control. Elias Vale, 24, son of Orin, observer of time, destroyer of paths, builder of echo loops. Maybe all of that was true, maybe none of it, because lately, identity felt more like a temporary mask than a permanent state. He reached for the notebook but hesitated, his hands trembling in a way that felt unfamiliar to him, not just fear or fatigue, but misalignment, like his body was slightly out of sync with the moment it occupied. The sensation passed quickly, but it left a residue, something that clung to his spine like static. He opened the notebook anyway and flipped back to the last entry, written in handwriting that was almost his, but just off enough to feel alien. The sentence read, "You are not centered." He stared at it for a long time, his mind trying to rationalize it. Maybe he had written it in a fugue state, maybe it was an echo from a divergent self bleeding through the barrier, or maybe, and this thought settled heavier than the others, maybe another Elias had written it, one who wasn't supposed to be here. He didn't jump that day, not because he couldn't, but because he wasn't sure what version of himself would do the jumping, and that uncertainty was the beginning of a fracture. It started with dreams, vivid, violent, not symbolic but documentary, reliving memories he never made, a fight with Lyra in a hallway that didn't exist, Sierra dying in a car crash that never happened, Cal confessing something Elias didn't understand and waking up with tears in his eyes, the kind of sorrow that belonged to someone else. He stopped trusting his reflection, because sometimes it moved just a half second late, or not at all, and sometimes the face staring back at him wore an expression he didn't feel. It wasn't possession, it was proliferation. He was multiplying, not physically, but psychologically, spiritually, if that word still meant anything in a world where memory was just a location on a timeline. He walked through the house and noticed inconsistencies that grew more pronounced. The wallpaper in the hallway changed patterns from morning to night, the layout of bookshelves shifted, voices on the radio spoke in sentences that looped on themselves before correcting. The past was leaking in and reforming the present, not all at once, but in pulses, in edits, like reality was being rewritten in draft mode, and Elias was the red pen. He returned to the attic, not to jump, but to sit, to map the places in his mind where he felt least stable. He divided himself into sections: what he knew was true, what he feared was false, what he suspected was borrowed from a version of him that should never have crossed over, and at the center of that map was a question he hadn't been able to shake since the divergence signal. If time can fracture, why can't identity? The jumps had never been just about memory, they were about presence, about consciousness, and the more he revisited key events, the more his essence was being sliced into variations of intent, regret, hope, rage, each one left behind a copy of who he had been, and now they were all starting to bleed back, not as ghosts, but as urges, thoughts he didn't recognize, reactions that weren't his. One night, standing in front of a mirror, he smiled, not because he wanted to, but because the version looking back at him thought something was funny. He tried to trace the beginning of the fragmentation but couldn't find it. Maybe it started when he touched Kel. Maybe it started when Lyra looked at him across a timeline that wasn't hers. Or maybe it started long before, when Oren handed him the truth without telling him the cost. He confronted his father, not in anger, but in necessity. Oren sat silent all. Chapter 7, The Versions That Remember. He started waking up in places he didn't recognize, not strange rooms or unknown cities, but familiar ones altered slightly, like replicas constructed from imperfect memory. The color of the wallpaper was off, the doorknob too cold, the scent in the air missing something that should have been there, and it wasn't just the environment, it was his own body. Some mornings he found new scars, tiny cuts on the inside of his palms like he'd been clenching something sharp, a bruise on his shoulder in the shape of a fingerprint, his muscles sore in ways that didn't match what he remembered doing the day before. And then there were the gaps, holes in time where an hour would vanish, where a conversation would blur at the edges, where people looked at him like he'd said something meaningful that he couldn't recall. And it wasn't long before he realized it wasn't just him anymore. There were other versions, not copies, not illusions, but iterations of Elias Vale who had diverged, fractured, survived their own timelines, and started bleeding into his, not as ghosts or visitors, but as inhabitants. And some of them remembered. He found the first message on the bathroom mirror, written in steam, not words but numbers, coordinates, timestamps. He ignored it at first, thinking it a hallucination, but when he jumped without meaning to, without planning, it dropped him into one of those locations, a basement with no windows, a desk covered in schematics he had never drawn, and on the wall, dozens of Polaroids of himself, not posed, not smiling, but caught in motion, walking, staring, crying, bleeding. It was a shrine or a surveillance board, and some of the photos were marked with XS, deep red ink cutting through his eyes. He left without touching anything, without breathing too loud, and when he returned to his own time, he wasn't sure it was his anymore. The people were the same, the house still stood, but the clocks were 5 minutes fast and stayed that way no matter how many times he adjusted them. And Sarah called him Eli, which she never had before. The shift was small but irreversible, and the next morning he woke to find his hands writing without his command, scratching notes into the margins of a book he didn't remember opening. The handwriting was his, but tighter, angrier, and the words were direct. Stop searching for stability. It doesn't exist here. And beneath that, another line, almost pleading. She remembers. Follow her. He knew they meant Lyra. And yet the version they were referring to wasn't one he'd seen in weeks. She had vanished from the jumps, her memories now blurred or sealed, as if she'd been pulled out of rotation, protected or removed or evolved. He began looking for her in the present but never found her. Her apartment was empty, her digital trail static, her name erased from directories she used to populate. But in his dreams, she returned. Only it wasn't the Lyra he had known. It was a version of her, older, wiser, colder. She spoke in riddles and warnings, always standing just beyond reach, and her eyes, those eyes that once softened when she looked at him, now held a weight that said she had seen too much, remembered too much, and maybe had lived lives beyond what even he could trace. Elias began to feel hunted, not by some external enemy, but by consequence itself. Reality no longer snapped back into place after his returns. It stayed warped, fractured. Conversations looped without warning. Strangers addressed him by names that weren't his, and his own voice sometimes carried an accent he didn't recognize. The self was breaking down, or multiplying faster than he could contain, and the versions that had bled through were no longer passive. They were acting, reshaping events in his stead, sometimes helping, sometimes sabotaging. He started finding evidence, receipts for places he hadn't been, bruises he didn't earn, footage of himself walking streets in cities he hadn't visited. And more mirrors began showing reflections that didn't match. One blink behind, one smile too wide, one version he began calling. Chapter 8, When They Arrive. They didn't come all at once, they came in fragments, in moments that didn't belong, in seconds that repeated with microscopic differences, in doorways that led to rooms half an inch too narrow, in clocks that ticked with a rhythm of unfamiliar heartbeats. Elias noticed it first in the silence, a kind of stillness that didn't feel empty but overfilled, like something was hiding behind the quiet, watching, calculating. He had stopped jumping weeks ago, or at least he thought he had, but the dislocations kept happening, time tearing at the seams even when he stood perfectly still, and that's how he knew it wasn't him anymore. It was them, the versions that remembered, the ones that had watched, waited, learned, and now they were here, not metaphorically, not as hallucinations or dreams or theories scratched into the attic walls, but as presences, footprints in dust that reappeared after he swept them, fingerprints on fogged glass in a room he never entered, the faint warmth on a chair that should have been cold, and at night he heard them moving, not footsteps, but the subtle rearrangement of space, like the house was being rewritten from the inside out, and sometimes, when he passed by mirrors or dark windows, he caught glimpses of them, not all at once, not fully, just flashes, eyes that didn't blink at the right time, jaws that clenched before he thought of speaking, hands twitching toward knives that weren't there. They were trying to breach fully now, to step out of memory and into flesh, and each attempt left something behind, a tremor in the air, a blur in the reflection, a word spoken in his voice when his mouth stayed shut. He tried to track them, pin their entries, follow the temporal distortions like seismic waves, but the data didn't hold. The patterns collapsed under observation, as if they knew he was watching and changed course to avoid detection. It wasn't just a matter of being seen, it was about taking space, occupying reality like a virus occupies a cell, and Elias could feel himself thinning, like too much of him had been pulled through too many timelines and the shell that remained was paper stretched over fire. He started writing notes to himself again, not in the notebook that had become unreliable, rewritten without warning, but on the backs of photographs, taped beneath furniture, burned into the wooden beams with the tip of a heated screwdriver. Messages like, if you wake up here, don't trust your hands, or the red-eyed one can mimic emotion, or simply, do not believe the clock. And still it wasn't enough. The incursions became bolder. One version showed up at the foot of his bed at 3:14 a.m., just standing there, smiling, not moving, not blinking, until Elias turned on the light and it vanished, not disappeared, but blinked out, like a skip frame in film. And then there were two of them, later that week, one in the mirror brushing its teeth, the other in the garden pruning plants Elias had never owned, and both of them turned to look at him at the exact same moment, with the exact same slow tilt of the head, and in that moment Elias understood the truth he had been trying to ignore. They weren't invading, they were already here, they had always been here, and he was the anomaly, the one who resisted assimilation, the one who kept pulling back to preserve a self that no longer existed in any coherent form. Orin tried to help, in his own quiet way, boarding up parts of the house, disconnecting the clocks, filling the attic with white noise machines and copper wiring, muttering old equations under his breath like they were prayers. But it was too late. One morning Elias found him in the kitchen, staring at a pot of boiling water that never stopped boiling, even after the flame was gone. And when Elias touched his shoulder, Orin looked at him like he was a stranger, then said, "You're not the one I raised," and walked away, out the back door, into the fog, never to return. The house felt emptier after that. Not quieter, just more hollow, like it was echoing a life that had already ended. And Elias. Chapter 9, The Collapse Point. The collapse didn't happen in a burst of noise or light. It began in silence, in the absence of something essential, like forgetting how to blink or how to breathe. Elias first noticed it when the temperature refused to stabilize. The air would be cold in the morning and burning by noon, without any mechanical cause, without the sun moving in ways that made sense. Then came the shadows, wrong-sized, wrong-angled, moving faster than the things that cast them, sometimes pausing, sometimes reaching, and the house responded like it was sick. Floorboards that groaned in new tones, walls that pulsed subtly, and at the center of it all, Elias, walking through a world that no longer held shape long enough to trust. He tried to hold onto anchors, small things, the smell of coffee, the feel of pages between his fingers, the weight of the attic key in his palm, but they betrayed him one by one. The coffee tasted like soil, the pages erased themselves when he blinked, and the attic key turned into wax and melted in his grip. The versions had stopped hiding, they moved through the halls freely now, sometimes glancing at him with a passing familiarity, sometimes ignoring him completely. as if he were the anomaly, the late guest at a party that had already begun. And the worst part was how calm they were, how precise, each one moving with purpose like a gear in a machine he couldn't see the shape of, and he began to suspect that the machine was time itself, not as a linear path, or even a branching tree, but as a living network of recursive minds learning how to overwrite their own creators. And he had been both the architect and the failure protocol. He hadn't jumped in days, or maybe he had and just didn't remember. The boundaries between movement and stillness had eroded. He would stand in a room and blink and be somewhere else, wearing slightly different clothes, holding a cup he hadn't poured, hearing a version of Sierra call him by a name he didn't know, and the real fear wasn't being lost, it was being replaced, overridden, erased not in death but in continuity, because what terrified him most was the idea that the other versions weren't evil, weren't malicious, they were just more adapted, more evolved, and in a universe that rewarded recursion and resilience. The Elias who paused to remember, to regret, to feel, was simply less useful. The collapse point wasn't a place, it was a moment, a convergence of pressure where all branches began bending inward, trying to reconcile contradictions too great to coexist, and Elias could feel that moment approaching like the build-up to a seizure, tension in the static of the world, glass vibrating before a scream. He returned to the attic not to hide but to confront it. The room was alive now, not metaphorically. The walls flexed when he moved, the floor sighed beneath his steps, and hanging in the center of the ceiling was a clock that didn't tick but pulsed, syncing with his heartbeat even when it accelerated. On the walls were dozens of notebooks he hadn't written, each filled with theories he hadn't finished, and on the desk was a mirror with a crack down the middle, not physical, not on the glass, but in the reflection itself. His face split into two versions, both moving out of sync, both watching each other, and then slowly, both watching him. He blinked and the mirror was empty. The versions no longer needed representation, they were here, embodied. He felt them in his limbs. Urges that didn't belong to him, thoughts too sharp, too calculated. He would reach for something and not know why, speak a phrase he didn't remember learning, and then there were the dreams, but calling them dreams was generous. They were more like rehearsals, played out over and over in different configurations, him arguing with Lyra in 10 different languages, or in dying in 12 different ways, Cyril leaving, always leaving, and the memory looping until the room smelled like smoke and metal, and he would wake with blood under his fingernails and no idea whose it was. The collapse wasn't coming, it was here. Chapter 10, The Final Loop. He didn't remember deciding to return to the beginning, only that he woke with a weight of inevitability pressing down on him like a second spine. The attic had gone silent again, not peacefully but unnaturally, the kind of silence that came after something irreversible, the kind that held its breath before collapse, and when he stepped into it, it no longer felt like a room, it felt like a waiting mouth, like a clock coiled around its own final second. The air had texture now, threads of time thick enough to touch, vibrating with tension, each one humming with a different version of his heartbeat. Elias stood at the center, surrounded by notebooks he hadn't written, walls marked with equations he barely understood, and reflections he had never created staring at him from broken mirrors with eyes full of memory he didn't own. This was it. The collapse point had passed and time had stabilized not into order but into recursion. Every version of him that had ever jumped, watched, interfered, looped, lingered, regretted, all of them had bent reality into a closed system, an infinite recursion feeding on itself, and the only way forward was back, not metaphorically, not emotionally, but literally, to the first jump, the first fracture, the moment he stepped into memory and didn't step back the same. If he could reach it, maybe, just maybe, he could stop it, or seal it, or at the very least make it mean something. He sat cross-legged like he had the first time, palms flat on the warped wooden floor, and whispered a moment, not the date, because that didn't matter anymore, just the sensation, the heat of the room, the smell of lemon polish and paper, the sound of a pen scratching across a page. Lyra Thorne sitting in the library across from him, unknowing, unbroken, real, and the world folded in around him like a pocket closing, and suddenly he was there, not quite as he remembered, but close. The light was dimmer, the shadows longer, and Lyra wasn't writing. She was watching him, her eyes already locked to where he stood even before he arrived, and he knew then that this moment had been visited too many times, tampered, bent, duplicated until it had grown self-aware, recursive, reflective. She stood slowly, carefully, like she didn't want to frighten him, or maybe like she knew what he had come to do. "Elias," she said, and it wasn't a question, it was a confirmation, a name she'd said 100 different ways in 100 different timelines. He wanted to cry, but even that emotion felt borrowed, as if another version had wept here already and left the residue behind. She walked toward him and stopped only a few feet away, her presence impossibly steady, her expression unreadable, and for a moment he wondered if this was really Lyra at all or one of the ones who remembered. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a notebook, small, weathered, identical to the one he had burned months ago, and handed it to him, her voice softer. "Now, quieter, this is yours." Elias opened it and saw his own writing, tight and looping, a log of jumps, not from this version but from hundreds of others, stitched together across timelines by something more determined than memory. On the final page was a single sentence, written in trembling ink: "This is the last stable moment, everything after this collapses." She looked at him like she had nothing else to offer, and maybe she didn't, maybe all her versions had run out of chances too. He nodded, turned back toward the desk, sat, opened the notebook in front of him, and began to write. The pen moved without thought, documenting not time but consciousness, the shifting of selves through memory, the degradation of identity under pressure, the way choice becomes corrosion when played too many times. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the ink began to bleed off the page and onto his skin, as if the notebook couldn't hold the data anymore, and still he kept writing, because there was no other way to contain it, no other structure left that hadn't fractured. The light began to flicker, not around. Chapter 11, What Remains. When Elias woke, the silence didn't feel haunted anymore, it just felt quiet, not hollow, not threatening, just still, the way a forest feels after snowfall, every sound absorbed into the white. The attic looked unchanged but cleaner somehow, less distorted, like the air had exhaled for the first time in years. He sat up slowly, every movement stiff like he hadn't moved in days, maybe longer, and blinked against the light coming through the cracked window. It wasn't warm but it was steady, and that alone made it feel real, more real than anything he had touched since the fractures began. His mind felt slower now, as if it were recalibrating, as if the echoes had finally stopped talking over each other, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, he didn't hear footsteps that weren't his or voices that didn't belong. The notebook was gone, the strings on the walls were gone, the mirrors, the false reflections, the layers of time bleeding through each other, all gone, and in their place was dust, light, and wood, old and cracked but honest. He moved through the house carefully, testing the world like it might shatter if he breathed too hard, but nothing bent, nothing shifted. The hallway was just a hallway, the kitchen just a kitchen. The clocks ticked normally and the refrigerator still hummed like an old machine trying its best. Sierra's room was empty but intact, her bed made, the window open, the wind real, the sky blue without contradiction. He walked outside. Barefoot, grass damp with morning dew, not a loop, not a fabrication, just dew, and dirt and a slight breeze, and his chest hurt from how foreign it all felt, how clean, how stable, and that's when the grief hit. Not for what was lost but for what had never been real to begin with, for every version of himself that had burned out trying to correct something that maybe was never meant to be fixed. He sat in the yard for what felt like hours, hands on the earth, grounding himself not in memory but in moment, and when he finally stood, the sun had moved slightly across the sky, proof that time still passed, that it hadn't broken, and that he wasn't breaking with it. He didn't know what to do next, what to say, who to find, if there was even anyone to find, because the world that remained might not be the one he came from, might not contain Lyra or Orin or the countless strangers he had never gotten to know, but it was here, it was linear, and that meant it could be lived in. He returned to the attic that evening and found something on the floor beneath the window, not a note, not a sign, just a single object, a glass bead, smooth, pale blue, the size of a fingertip, and he didn't know why but he pocketed it, and every night after, he would take it out, hold it, stare at it like it held something more, something left behind by one of them, maybe by himself, maybe by her, a seed of memory that refused to dissolve completely. He never jumped again. Not because he was afraid, but because he no longer needed to. There was nothing left to find in the past that would serve the present, and the present, as fractured and incomplete as it was, finally felt like his. Sometimes he would hear things, distant, faint, a flicker of a familiar voice or a moment he knew he hadn't lived, but they passed quickly, like dust on wind, like dreams fading after waking, and he accepted them, not as warnings or invitations, but as reminders of what he had been, what he had survived, and what remained. He started writing again, not logs, not theories, just thoughts, pages that didn't try to solve time but reflected what it felt like to live with it again. He filled notebook after notebook, never looking back at what he had written, always forward, always turning the next page, and somewhere in that process, he began to feel whole, not healed, not restored, but whole in a way that meant something had closed, not in destruction, but in completion. And one night, as the wind moved through the attic like it was brushing against the walls in gratitude, he dreamed of Lyra again, not the fracture. Chapter 12, The End Before the Beginning. The boy stood at the window of the airport, forehead pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the surface in slow, rhythmic pulses, the kind of pattern only children and ghosts make. His eyes scanned the tarmac where nothing moved, no planes, no people, just empty space stretching into a gray horizon that might have been sky or memory or both. Behind him the terminal was quiet, a low hum of lights and vending machines filling the silence where voices used to be, and somewhere far off, a recorded announcement repeated itself into the void, delayed by half a second like the airport was unsure if anyone was still listening. Elias watched the boy, not moving, not speaking, just standing there with the faint shape of something in his pocket, a glass bead or a marble or the last piece of something broken that still held meaning. He didn't speak to the boy, didn't have to, because he recognized that stillness, that moment before motion, that breath before choice. It was the same stillness that had once lived inside him before the first jump, before the first fracture, before the first version of himself peeled away from the spine of the original and whispered a different truth into the dark, and now it had come full circle, not in the way stories pretend things wrap neatly, but in the way time folds into itself when it runs out of places to go. The loop wasn't a circle, it was a spiral, closing tighter with each revolution until only one outcome remained, and this was it. A boy and a man watching each other through mirrored glass, one at the beginning, one at the end, both holding the same name, the same weight, the same question that had never really been answered. What happens when the story starts where it's supposed to end? Elias didn't feel fear anymore. He didn't feel much of anything beyond awareness, a clarity that didn't need language, the kind of understanding that came after burning through every illusion and stepping into the ash barefoot. The airport felt like memory made physical, a place out of sync with time, preserved not because it mattered but because something needed to end there, and maybe something else needed to begin. He didn't approach the boy, didn't need to, because as soon as the clock struck 3:14 the fog on the glass cleared and Elias saw his own reflection layered over the child's face, like a photograph developing in reverse, and he finally understood that he had never been sent back to change the past. He had been sent back to remember it, to hold it in place long enough for it to settle, to stop spiraling, and now that it had, now that everything that could fracture had fractured, what remained was a single moment, whole and quiet and finite. The boy blinked slowly, then turned as if someone had called his name, but no one had, not in this reality, and he walked away from the window without looking back, his small figure dissolving into the soft hum of departure, and Elias stood alone again, only now it didn't feel like loss, it felt like release, like a final page turned without regret. He walked through the terminal, past empty gates and rows of forgotten chairs, past a flickering departures screen that no longer listed times or destinations but glitched between static and silence, and as he stepped through the automatic doors at the end of the corridor, he expected the world to feel unfamiliar, but it didn't. It felt new, not because it had changed, but because he had stopped trying to rewrite it. Outside, the sky was clean, the air sharp with winter, and he stood still for a long time, breathing, existing, not thinking of other versions or better choices or echoes that had once called his name from the far side of fractured timelines. Just here, just now, just Elias, and that was enough. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the bead, its surface smooth and slightly warm, a leftover memory that no longer demanded attention, only acknowledgement. He placed it on the ground beside his foot, not as a marker, not as a goodbye, but as a reminder that some things endure, not because t. What would you do if you could jump into a memory, not to change it, but to finally understand it? Would you trust your own mind, knowing it's just one version of 100 that might be out there, watching, waiting, becoming you? Elias Vale's story ends where it began. But maybe your story is just starting. So tell me, if you could relive one moment, which would it be? And would it still be yours once you touched it? Let me know in the comments. I'm listening. We all are. Because in a timeline full of echoes, the only thing that lasts is what we choose to remember.